the founding father of Singapore, Kuan Yew, has died after a relatively short illness. He was the man that in 1959 changed Singapore from a fairly lawless and unassuming port city into one of the world's great powers and one of the world's most stable economies. In the studio in Johannesburg now is Gordon Institute of Business Sciences Professor Nick Binedell. Nick, what an extraordinary man this was, and the lessons that we could learn here. I just want to read you something from Forbes. He didn't tolerate corruption, to eliminate the temptation and attract capable people. He paid government officials high salaries, tight grip on spending, pushed down taxes. He only paid 20% in Singapore. He knew the folly of weak money. Singapore dollar looks like the Rock of Gibraltar. It goes on and on. What a lesson to certain other countries.
Absolutely. He was an extraordinary leader. He was in government formally for 30 years. He led the People Action Party to victory after victory at the polls, and some might criticize some of Singapore's political practices, but from an economic point of view, a truly remarkable story. They started off with a $400 or $500 per capita income, ended up with $55,000 per capita income in a country with no natural resources, and they still import 95% of their food. It's a remarkable story.
So clearly South Africa has quite a bit to learn from them. What's the initial starting point? Because clearly we have to deal with many conundrums, from Eskom to commodity prices and the lack of natural resources that we're managing to beneficiate from by ourselves.
Well, Guga, I don't know if one, how much one learns from countries. Each have their own trajectory and their own story, and Singapore's is pretty unique. But I think the discipline and the fact that, as was mentioned, he was a very tough disciplinarian in government and broader in the community. They developed a strategy for Singapore, which they shaped into plans that evolved over decades. They first became a port, and then into manufacturing, then financial services, then education, and then biotechnology. They're now the third-ranked biotechnology country in the world. That's a remarkable achievement in the space of 40 years. So I think what we can learn is that with good discipline in government and strong leadership, and he provided that right to the end of his life, in fact. Although he wasn't in cabinet for the last years, he was an advisor. So it's a good strategy, accountable leadership, and a lot of discipline, and they just simply didn't tolerate corruption.
No, indeed. And unfortunately, you can have the leaders say one thing, and I know a lot of leaders in South Africa are very vigorous in their ideas, and a lot of those ideas might actually be very similar to what Singapore employed in the 1960s and beyond. I mean, for example, he pursued a vigorous housing program, it says here, again from Forbes, that enabled people who didn't earn high incomes to buy their houses. His was a model for how low subsidies need not lead to the housing-related disasters, etc. A very, very well-developed healthcare system as well, benefiting all. You have to have the buy-in of the people, not just the ideas of the leaders.
And extremely sensitive to public opinion. I was there during the financial crisis, and Goh Chok Tong, who was his successor, we were having a lunch, and he was explaining how concerned they are about pensioners who'd lost their money during the crisis. They had tremendous sensitivity to public opinion, of course in a different political system. So, my answer to what we can learn from them is actually you learn from everyone and you copy no one, because you must know where you are. But this disciplined approach to planning and execution was truly phenomenal. The partnership between business and government, also exemplary. The Singapore government started a company called Temasek, which it owns, which has gone from a small investment business to an over $200 billion portfolio of global investments that just keeps providing returns to the government of Singapore. So in all sorts of ways, many, many lessons to learn.
And maybe that's a starting point. Just last week, Lindsay and I were speaking to a gentleman with regard to the compensation that chief executives of state-owned entities often receive, and that's obviously in light of the issues that are currently facing Eskom. How do you balance that? And maybe let's focus here on South Africa. We do know that state-owned entities, not all of them are performing at their peak, but yet we want to get top-class talent. Are we remunerating them correctly, or how do we find some kind of equilibrium there?
Well, in Singapore, they hold these executives highly accountable. So every government agency that's in business that I've worked with, there's a lot of measurement, a lot of performance review, and you review it every 6 months, and you just moved out if you don't perform. So within Temasek, this government-owned enterprise is run like a business. I think our state-owned enterprise employees CEOs are very highly paid. As our president is highly paid in relative terms. But how we fix that is a very tough question, because I don't think there's the discipline to hold us accountable for performance the way they do. They measure everything. You know, an MP in Singapore showed me his weekly timesheet that he has to account every
Sure.
half hour of a 6-day week. Every Friday he would meet with his senior MP and account for his time. And when I looked at it, it was refuse removal, a kid in the wrong school, quite detailed stuff, but they were actively involved and reporting it and measuring it and rewarding it. So a very disciplined state, in some ways a bit unnervy because it doesn't have a lot of spontaneity. It's a very managed society. But that management has produced for Singaporeans, you know, 1 or 2 or 3 most competitive economy in the world, very high levels of growth, tremendous foreign investment. There are 7,000 multinationals with their head offices in Singapore. In the Great Recession, within 6 months, they changed the tax regime to make sure they stayed. Very agile, very, very flexible, very performance-driven.
It's difficult to imagine that, obviously these two societies are very different, Singapore and South Africa. They share the first letter and there I think it ends. It's difficult to imagine somebody working a 6-day week, first of all, consistently with a 10-day holiday and having to account for every single half hour of his or her time. I don't think South Africans are of that type of person. I don't think we have that discipline. But on the other hand, if Lee Kuan Yew was replaced, let's say, for example, our president, and implemented the same things that Lee Kuan Yew did in Singapore in 1959, do you think the results would be different, slightly different, or a complete flop?
A very big part of Singapore's success was the building of government and other institutions. And what lay behind that was the capability to run them well and the ambition to survive. Singapore is a very small island. At the time, it was surrounded by hostile neighbors who were very doubtful. It was thrown out of Malaysia. Indonesia was pretty hostile, so the odds were against them. I think our culture has been, the odds are in favor of us. And Singapore's quite paranoid in that way, and they've kept that paranoia. Year after year, government says, we've grown X, we don't know if we can continue. So behind all that lies a phenomenal education system. Public education system. They've attracted the best business schools, the best medical schools, engineering, and they focused on that. They didn't do lots of BAs in liberal arts. They focused on productive education that will build a competitive nation because they didn't have the natural resources. So, you know, no two countries can start in the same place. We simply don't. And I think that's the danger of comparing countries. But some principles, absolutely. Accountable government, agile strategy, and long-term thinking. I think Singapore's taught that not just to countries like South Africa, but to many other countries, that a focused strategy with accountable leadership delivers long-term results. And maybe they've traded off a bit of human rights. I feel that way about it. But nevertheless, you know, to increase someone's income by 100 times in your lifetime is a remarkable achievement.
So then your thoughts on where South Africa is at the moment, Nick? Are we at a transformation stage?
Well, I think we're entering you know, economically, of course, we all know that we're not performing the way we should. We've got this amazing human capital, these amazing natural resources, and this remarkable story of change. But somehow I think we're just not leveraging the story, and we've lost a bit of our focus. South Africa sometimes reminds me of a big jigsaw puzzle, but we don't know where the box is, so we don't know what it is we're working towards. We've kind of lost some of that vision and energy. And I think that it's very, very important that all South Africans take ownership of their piece of the jigsaw puzzle and connect it with other pieces of the jigsaw puzzle so we can construct that energy. We rely so much on government, so much on political leadership. I think the strength of the private sector, the strength of civil society are very important in South Africa, and we need to come together a little more than we do. There's so much at stake. We can't lose a generation without providing healthcare, education, infrastructure. Whether it's broadband or a primary care clinic, we need these institutions, and we've got them. Sandton is the center of the African economy, but we're not leveraging it enough. And it's not easy. You know, it's going to be a long journey, this, I think. We've entered an era of a tougher economy, and people are suffering out there, as we all know. So it does require all of us to contribute, and not just to keep saying, well, the leaders must show us the way. I think a sound democracy and a great culture, it's the people that are the strength. And the South African middle class needs us to engage a bit more in public life, as so many institutions are encouraging them to do. If you want to live in a stable country, you've got to work for the country, not just yourself or your organization.
Exactly. Well, 21 years of democracy. Hopefully this does mark the beginning of significant change. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much, Gugu.
Thanks to GIBS head there, Professor Nick Binedell.